All right, well, it's after 4 o'clock, so I guess we will get going. Right now, it's just you and me, Judy. So I don't know where everyone else at. Hopefully, they will show up very soon. I only heard from one person who's not able to be here tonight, so I would assume we should have four other folks joining us along the way. So, but since it is after 4 o'clock, you and I are here, so we'll go ahead and start. Um, Again, hopefully others will show up. If no one else shows up, then we'll just go through the course and the class session tonight. I'm recording it like I always do. Let me make sure I got the recording running. And so since I'm recording, I'm just going to go through a normal lecture and class session as I normally would. And then we'll upload the recording up to the Beachboard site. So others who are not here tonight will be able to watch it later on this week. And it is an important class tonight because we are going to cover some information that will be very helpful for the final assessment. And I've gone through all the midterm assessments. I've gone through all the Beachboard essay number 3 responses, and those have been graded and returned with feedback. When you take a look at your midterm assessment, what you'll see is the little yellow annotation boxes. I use that to provide feedback. And so if you just look at what you submitted, you'll see the yellow feedback box and just click on that feedback box or hover your mouse over that feedback box and you'll be able to see the feedback I provided. All the grades for the most part were all very good. So no issues with the midterm assessment. I think everyone did a nice job. I will apologize in advance because I have allergies that have really been flaring up the past 2 days. And so I apologize if my voice is a little strange and I have to take a break here and there, but the midterm assessments are good. I know that it's kind of awkward to have submitted a midterm and then to turn around and have to start talking about, thinking about the final assessment. But it's kind of the nature of these accelerated hybrid courses. You know, we only have 7 Zoom sessions together. This is our 6th of 7. And so after tonight, we only have next Tuesday, and that's our last Zoom session. And since our class officially ends in terms of all assignments have to be turned in by March 15th, we only have 2 weeks left. And I've always told you that whenever we have these assessments, I'll make them available 2 weeks in advance of the due date. 2 weeks in advance of the due date for the final assessment is tonight. And so I thought it'd be instructive to go through the final assessment and just show you some of the things I'm asking for. It is available on the Beachboard site, but you know me, I always like to go through these assessments in advance so everyone's on the same page and they know exactly what to expect. But before we get to that, just one last reminder is that you had Beachboard essay number 4, and that is due next week on March 7th. Beachboard essay number 4, you've already pretty much done, because all I'm asking you to do is to take the answer that you gave me on the midterm assessment, talking about public administration as a discipline and the argument you make for whether or not it's a discipline, and just expand on that a little bit then for your 4th Beachboard essay. So pretty much I'd say 90-95% of Beachboard essay number 4 is already done. Just a matter of copying and pasting it into the Beachboard area and then responding to 2 of your classmates. And that will then constitute Beachboard number 4. So let me just run really quickly through the final assessment, the types of scenarios on the final assessment and the types of questions related to those scenarios, just so that everyone's familiar with what you're going to be doing for this final assessment that is then due by midnight on March 15th, 2 weeks from tonight. So what I've tried to do with the final assessment is it's not cumulative, so it will only cover material from the end of the midterm through next week's class. Once we're done with tonight's material, you'll have all the information you need to pretty much answer 3 of the 5 scenarios. Those remaining 2 scenarios, you'll then get the information for those 2 scenarios then next week when you talk about managing human and managing fiscal resources. So this first scenario we have on here deals with civil service and federal employment. And if we have time tonight, we'll get into this material. Again, a lot of it depends on how many folks we have in class tonight. But if we do have time, we have an adequate number of folks, we'll go ahead and get into this material tonight. But The first scenario reads, your friend applied for a job with the FBI 8 months ago. She is obviously frustrated with the delay in the hiring process. Bills need to be paid, so she finally decided to accept a job with the private sector company. She laments to you how she wishes she could have waited for the FBI job, but doesn't understand how federal government hires new employees. And when we talked about public versus private sector organizations, we talked a lot about, this difference in the hiring process and how the hiring process is much more protracted and much longer in the public sector as compared to the private sector. And that's primarily due to things like civil service that we'll talk about, as well as collective bargaining, which we'll also talk about when we talk about human resources. So as a good student of public administration, you decide to provide her with some background information on the eras of public employment in the United States. Describe the three main eras of public federal employment and how these eras have changed over the years. And we'll present three distinct eras of federal employment: the era of gentlemen, the era of spoils, and the era of merit. That's what I'm looking for then with that answer to question 1A. Question 1B, after regaling your friend with the history of federal employment, you begin to reflect on current hiring practices. Which eras are best represented by federal employment, today's federal employment, and why? So those three eras, which one do you typically see in today's approach to federal employment, federal hiring? So that's 1B. Question 2, or scenario 2, you walk into an organization that, I think I need to scroll up a little bit. Here we go. Question 2, the Department of Aging, and this is the same Department of Aging that we had a scenario for on the midterm assessment. It now has a new leader. Mr. Lemon, who you'll remember from the midterm assessment, is gone, and the new governor has selected you as the head of the department. You walk into an organization that has neglected human resource management functions for years. One of your first meetings is with your human resources director to discuss how to modernize HR functions. Positions have not been reviewed for several years, and most employees are working outside of their position descriptions. And as we'll talk about more fully when we talk about civil service, either tonight or next week, depending on our timing, we'll talk about the whole idea of position classification, the idea of position descriptions. And working outside your position description just basically means that you are responsible for and doing duties and tasks that are not included within your written description. 2A, what would you instruct your human resources director to do? In other words, what functions of human resource management need to be completed? And then 2B, another major issue faced by the organization is its relationships with its bargaining units. The current contract has expired and the union and department are now at an impasse. Please discuss the strategies that can be used to resolve this impasse. Again, that's information we will get to. Then scenario number 3 is your managing fiscal resources scenario, which we will do next week. The city of Preble Heights, another throwback to our midterm, is struggling with its budget. It uses a simple line item budget and typically increases expenditures each year in connection with increases in GDP or gross domestic product rates. Over the past 5 years, the city has failed to complete its budget on time and has struggled to balance revenues and expenditures. The city auditor found that many programs are inefficient and are not achieving their goals and their objectives. Standard & Poor's and Moody's, and these are two credit rating agencies that assess the credit worthiness of local governments, both reduced the city's credit rating due to its budget issues. As a council member, you and your colleagues need to recommend a new budgeting format to try and alleviate these concerns. So in 3A, select and recommend a new budget format for the city that will address the concerns in this scenario. And next week, when we talk about managing fiscal resources, we will talk about several different budget formats, and we will really pay close attention to 4 different budget formats: line item budgeting, performance-based budgeting, program-based budgeting, and zero-based budgeting. So you'll be selecting one of those 4 formats and recommending that for the city to use. Then in 3B, the city's aquatic center needs renovation. Given the city's fiscal problems, it is clear that the city lacks the resources to complete the project without borrowing money. The aquatic center is open to citizens for lap swimming Monday through Saturday from 2 p.m. to 7 p.m. Citizens pay a $3 fee to use the facility, and 100 residents use the facility for lap swimming 200 days out of the year. The city also charges a $20,000 a year fee to the school district and club teams that use the facility for practices. A total of 6 teams pay this fee. That's all the operating revenue that the aquatic center is generating. The operating expenses for the aquatic center amount to $180,000 per year. Since the city does not have the money to pay for renovations, it proposes a bond to cover the cost. Whenever we do major capital projects like buildings and renovations to aquatic centers, we oftentimes issue debt. We borrow money to do that, and the mechanism we use to borrow that money is what's called a bond. So here the city is proposing a bond to cover the cost of the renovations. Which type of bond would you recommend and why? And again, we'll talk about different types of bonds and their advantages and their disadvantages next week when we do management of fiscal resources. Then scenario 4 is one that you can answer now because it covers information that we had talked about in our last week's session when we talked about policy. So at least 4A you're able to answer. 4B you'll be able to answer after tonight. But 4A you can answer right now if you'd like to. The City of Preble Heights also has a unit known as the Economic Revitalization Department, or the ERD. ERD's primary task is to implement a policy known as the Urban Revitalization Initiative. The initiative provides cash grants to businesses who renovate their facilities and remain in urban areas as opposed to moving to other states. The primary beneficiaries of the grants are obviously business owners who are willing to stay where they are and continue to contribute to economic growth in urban areas of the city, which is primarily downtown. To be successful, the policy would need to provide grant money to offset the cost savings of potentially moving to other states and areas. Not all members of the ERD are in favor of the policy goals and believe it is not the role of government to influence business decisions. These employees have sometimes been accused of slow-walking grant applications to delay the payment of money to applicants. So in 4A, from a policy implementation perspective, utilize Pressman and Wildowski, who we talked about last week, and we talked about them last week in terms of implementers slowing down the implementation process based upon how strongly they feel about a policy and how strongly they support the policy or strongly they oppose the policy. Use that type of approach to illustrate some of the barriers to successfully implementing this policy. And then in 4B, information we're going to cover tonight, drawing upon the 4 models of organizational effectiveness, which we'll talk about tonight after we're done with program evaluation, examine this scenario from the perspective of each of these models. How would each model define the agency's effectiveness in implementing this policy? So half that question you're ready to answer. The second half of the question, 4B, you'll have to wait till we're done with our material for tonight. Then in scenario number 5, this is your program evaluation scenario. And so you'll be ready to answer this one as soon as we are done with our material for this evening. It has now been 2 years since Preble Heights renovated its recreation center. The Parks and Recreation Commissioner, Julia Lopez, approached the council last year with a proposal to address juvenile delinquency in the city. The city has seen a rise in the incidence of graffiti and vandalism over the past several years. Ms. Lopez proposed creating a program of after-school sports offered free of charge at the Recreation Center. The after-school sports programs offered from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. Monday through Friday, and 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. on Saturdays. The goal of the program is to give youth something to do after school and deter them from engaging in acts of graffiti and vandalism. The program has been up and running for 1 year. You are a program specialist, and the city manager has approached you to create a program evaluation to evaluate the effectiveness of the after-school sports program. 5A, identify and discuss the primary independent variable, dependent variable, and control variables that you would use in your program evaluation. We'll cover all that tonight. And then 5B, identify and discuss the research design that you would recommend using to evaluate the effectiveness of this program. Again, material that we will cover tonight. So between what we cover tonight and what we'll cover next week with managing human resources and managing fiscal resources, by the end of class next week, you'll have all the information you need for doing all 5 of the scenarios on the final assessment. Well, that's the final assessment. Again, it's available for you to read through. If you have any questions on the final assessment as you start working on it, please feel free to send me an email, contact me, and I'm happy to clarify any questions that you may have about the final assessments. But as always, just like with the midterm assessment, there are no right or wrong answers necessarily, and that your responses will be evaluated based upon your ability to justify your responses and to convince me that your response is indeed one of the more appropriate responses to that scenario. Okay. All righty. Let me go ahead now and share out our slides for tonight. And the plan for tonight is that we are going to pick up where we left off last week, which we left off talking about public policy. And we were talking about public policy within this perspective of what public administrators do. And so the public administrators, one of the major functions of public administrators is to engage in both the formulation as well as the implementation and evaluation of public policies. We talked about what public policies are. We said when you think about public policies versus public programs, we're thinking about public policies as kind of that overarching umbrella, and then it's the specific public programs that then help to achieve those overarching goals of that public policy. So in addition to engaging in policy analysis, formulation, implementation, evaluation, we also engage in program implementation and evaluation as well. So in this MPA program, you will get into a discussion of program evaluation when you get to your PPA 696 research methods course. And as I talked to you about earlier, I know it's a little unusual. We call our 696 course, we call it research methods when really it's taught as program evaluation. And that's just primarily for the ease of curriculum changes, essentially, is why that's done. But the 696 research methods class really is about program evaluation. It's about how can we take some of these skills that we are very familiar with in the world of social science research and then apply those skills to how we can evaluate programs, public programs, from an empirical basis. And that's the whole purpose of program evaluation, to apply empirical methods, oftentimes in the world of social science research, to determine the effectiveness of a public program. Now, again, when we are implementing policies, hopefully we want those policies to be effective. We want them to be achieving their goals. We want them to be meeting the needs of the consumers, meeting the needs of citizens, beneficiaries of those policies. It's the same type of thing with public programs. We want them to be effective in achieving their goals, and we want them to truly meet the wants, needs, and desires of those beneficiaries who are going to be participating in the programs and generating benefits from those public programs. So with our very basic definition, we're talking about applying empirical methods to determine effectiveness of a program, which begs the question, what makes a method empirical? When we say something is empirical, what makes something empirical? Anybody want to venture an answer to that question of what makes something empirical? What do we mean by the term empirical? Any ideas on what may be empirical? And here in the world of public administration, obviously we're operating within the rubric of social sciences. And so most of what we do in the social sciences, as well as in the natural sciences, is usually predicated upon collecting empirical data, collecting empirical evidence. Empirical evidence is basically evidence that's tangible. It's information, it's data that we can actually touch, we can feel, we can analyze directly. So for something to be empirical, it needs to be something that we can sense, something that we can measure, we can collect, and we can measure. Empirical subsumes both qualitative as well as quantitative information. So empirical can be qualitative, in that we're talking about information that is described with words and phrases, or it can be quantitative, where it can be boiled down and distilled into actually numbers. It can be either qualitative or quantitative. We're going to use this empirical information. We're going to use empirical methods so that we can ascertain the effectiveness of the program with a great deal of confidence. Now, in program evaluation, just like in social science research, we can never be 100% confident. There are just too many other variables out there. We're dealing with human beings. Human beings sometimes can be irrational. Sometimes they don't behave in rational types of behavioral patterns. So we're never going to be as confident about our conclusions as we would be in the natural sciences. When the natural sciences, we can control the environment in which our evaluations are being done. We can't really do that in the social sciences and public administration. So we're never going to be 100% confident that, yes, indeed, this program is achieving its goals, but we want to be as confident as we can possibly be, which is why we use empirical types of data and empirical types of methods. When we do program evaluation, there are two basic types of program evaluation we do in the public sector. One's what's called an impact evaluation, and this is where we're looking at the consequences of this program and how well this program is meeting the needs of the citizens who are consuming this program. And the second type is the implementation-oriented evaluation, where we look at how well we are implementing this program on a daily basis. Now, you can do either an impact evaluation or an implementation evaluation, or you can also combine them together into one singular program evaluation. But it's very important that we engage in program evaluation in the public sector so that we know we are spending our resources in effective ways, so that we can know whether or not the resources, these millions of dollars that we're putting toward these programs, are actually achieving the goals that we intend for them to achieve. Program evaluation is such an important part of public administration that we have made it a core course, 696, in our core curriculum. That's how important it is. It's really one of the 5 main core skills that you get here in the Long Beach MPA program. So how do we do program evaluation? The steps in program evaluation are going to follow pretty closely the steps that you would do in a classic social science research project. And you know from your undergraduate research methods courses, or if you had the 517 course here in our MPA program, you're familiar with the idea of generating research questions. And you know the research question really is the touchstone of everything that you do in a research project. Every step you take, and every single thing that you do in that project should relate back to helping you answer your fundamental research question. Well, here in program evaluation, we use evaluation questions, which again are very similar to research questions. They need to be clear, our questions need to be answerable, and they need to have more than one possible answer. If there's only one possible answer to an evaluation question, we probably already know what that answer is. So they need to be clear, answerable, and have more than one possible answer. So to give you an example, if you haven't done program evaluation before, back a few years ago in the 696 case study that we used in directed research, the case study was oriented around a reading intervention program for people who are incarcerated in prison. And the idea is that people who participate in this reading intervention program would probably reduce their rates of recidivism. We would anticipate that participants in the program would have lower rates of recidivism. So the evaluation question we'd write for a program like that would be, does the inmate reading intervention program, this program that exposes incarcerated individuals to a reading, does this intervention program decrease rates of recidivism? That's what we call a directional type of evaluation question. So we're asking, does participation, as participation goes up, do rates of recidivism go down? Another way to phrase that question could be, how does the inmate reading intervention program affect rates of recidivism? That's a non-directional question. We're not asking, does it increase rates of recidivism? Does it decrease rates of recidivism? We're just asking, how does it affect rates of recidivism? Typically, when you are doing program impact evaluations, you are doing causal research. We're looking at, does the program or does participation in the program cause the intended outcome? So it's usually going to be causal research that we are doing in program impact types of evaluations. Then you also know, if you're doing a classic social science research project, you're also going to spend some time clearly identifying and measuring your variables. Well, we use variables here in program evaluation as well. In classic social science research, you will look at the relationship between your primary independent variable and your dependent variable. Here in program evaluation, our independent variable will be some measure of the program that we are evaluating. So it could be participation in the program. So for the inmate reading intervention program, we could measure our independent variable as, did the inmate participate or not participate in the intervention program? The kind of yes, no type of situation. We could measure that variable in a binary dichotomous way, where all those people who participated are scored a 1, all those people who did not participate are scored a 0. That's a very basic way of measuring participation. If we want to get a little bit more nuanced with our independent variable, we could measure the extent of participation. So maybe we'll measure the number of hours that an inmate spent participating in the reading intervention program. And so that then takes it from a nominal type of measurement, a binary measurement, into something a little bit more integral in nature, where we can say, well, this person spent 20 hours versus this person who spent 50 hours. Another way we can measure the inmate reading intervention program is, instead of measuring an individual's participation, we can measure it more longitudinally in terms of measuring rates of recidivism before the reading program went into effect, and then measuring rates of recidivism after the program went into effect. So therefore, if you do it that way, your independent variable then goes back to being binary. It scored a 0 for all those years before the program was in effect, and then a 1 for all those years after the program was implemented. But your independent variable typically is going to be some measure of the program or participation in that program. The dependent variable is going to be the result of the program. This is the desired effect, the desired outcome of the program. So in our example, it would be rates of recidivism. Our goal in social science research is always to try and isolate the relationship between our primary independent variable and our dependent variable. Well, likewise, here in program evaluation, we are trying to isolate the relationship between participation in the intervention program and recidivism as our dependent variable. But we recognize that there are a lot of other variables that could affect likelihood of recidivism other than participation in the reading intervention program. Maybe the type of crime that was committed initially could have an impact upon rates of recidivism. Typically, if it's a drug-related crime, rates of recidivism are usually going to be higher. Whether or not the person, when they get out of prison, whether or not they have a verifiable address, could have an impact upon rates of recidivism. Whether or not that person is employed on a full-time basis could have an impact upon rates of recidivism. So there are all these other variables out there that could affect recidivism other than our inmate reading intervention program. So it becomes important for us to identify all those other possible explanations for changes in rates of recidivism. Those then become, obviously, as you know, our control variables. So if we can control for all these other things and parcel them out, then we can isolate the true relationship between participating in this inmate reading intervention program and whether or not that person is going to reoffend. That's what we want to do. That's our ultimate goal in our program evaluation. Because again, the ultimate goal of the program evaluation is to determine how effective is this public program in achieving its stated goals and objectives. So once we have our question, once we have identified and come up with operational definitions for our variables, just like in social science research, we then have to select and implement a research design. For causal research, there are basically two different types of research designs. There are experimental designs and there are quasi-experimental designs. Non-experimental designs are usually not included in this discussion because a non-experimental design is not going to allow you to assert causation. It's just simply is not capable of doing that. So for program evaluations, they're typically experimental or quasi-experimental in nature. An experimental design is one that uses random assignment. So we are going to randomly assign some subjects to participate in the program and randomly assign other subjects to not participate in the program. Those who participate in the program become, in research, what we call our experimental group. In program evaluation, we call experimental groups project groups. So it's just a change in terminology, but it's the same type of thing. Our experimental or a project group, whichever term you prefer, those are the folks who are actually engaging in participating in this program. Then our control group, as you would call it in experimental research, in social science research, in program evaluation, we call those control groups comparison groups. And those are the folks who are not being exposed to the independent variable. Those are people who are not participating in the program. The important thing in experimental research is we will randomly assign some people to participate in the program and randomly assign other people to not participate in the program, thus creating our experimental and our control group, our project and our comparison group. The idea behind random assignment is if we are truly randomly assigning people to the experimental and to the control group, that random assignment will guarantee that those people in the experimental and the control group are equivalent on all variables and all characteristics. The only difference between our experimental group and our control group will be participation in the program. That's the only difference between the two groups. And if that's the only difference between the two groups, guess what? You can then isolate the relationship. So if recidivism rates are higher for those who did not participate in the program as compared to those who did participate in the program, then you can assert with confidence that participation in the program is having an impact, having a positive impact upon recidivism rates. That those who participate in the program have a lower likelihood to reoffend. That's what random assignment gives you, because it makes your two groups equivalent on everything else other than participation in the program. The most common type of experimental group is that classic experimental group that I'm sure you've run into before in your undergraduate research classes. Denote it with your R and O and X and O. So in your experimental group, you have R, O, X, O. The R stands for random assignment. The first O stands for an observation. This is where we're going to measure them on their dependent variable. The X stands for participation in the program when the independent variable is applied. And then the second O is a post-observation after they've participated in the program. For your control group, it's the same except there's no X because they're not participating in the program. That's your classic experimental design. I've also listed on the screen for you some modifications on that classic experimental design. We won't have to worry about digging too deep into that right now. You'll get into that in your 696 course. On the final assessment, where I'm asking for research design, I'm just basically asking for either an experimental or quasi-experimental. You don't have to really delve deeply into different types of experimental and quasi-experimental designs. So for our purposes here in 500, it's good enough to say experimental designs use that random assignment. However, as we know, we are evaluating public programs. Some of those public programs we are evaluating are what we refer to as entitlement programs. Entitlement programs are programs based upon eligibility. That everyone who meets the eligibility requirements, they are guaranteed the opportunity to participate in that program. we cannot deny people who qualify to participate, we cannot deny them the benefits of that program. We legally cannot do that. We ethically cannot do that. We practically cannot do that. So in a lot of our program evaluations, we are unable to use random assignment. Therefore, we're unable to design an experimental design. So the alternative for us are quasi-experimental designs. And this is what is the norm in most public program evaluations. Because of legal, ethical, and practical reasons, we cannot use random assignment, so we use these things called quasi-experimental designs. In a quasi-experimental design, you are not randomly assigning people to participate in the program and people not to participate in the program. You don't have that amount of control. Sometimes they self-select whether or not to participate in that program. A lot of our public assistance programs in this country are not automatic. The people are not automatically enrolled in those types of assistance programs. They have to enroll themselves. And so you could have a whole population of individuals and households who are eligible to participate, but they don't know the program exists, or they don't know how to go through the application process, and so they don't ever actually participate in that program or derive benefits from that program. So we cannot randomly assign people. They are self-selecting whether or not to participate. So in those situations, we use the quasi-experimental design. So we compare people who are participating in the program, which is our experimental or our project group, to those who chose not to participate in the program, which will be our control or our comparison group. The problem for us, though, is because we do not have random assignment, we cannot guarantee that those two groups are equivalent. You know, maybe our participant group, our experimental group, maybe those folks have a higher education level, higher educational attainment level than those who do not participate. Maybe they tend to be a little bit more affluent than those who do not participate. And so they're not equivalent in terms of their characteristics. So what we have to do in quasi-experimental designs is we have to try and make them equivalent. And the way in which we can make them equivalent is through the use of control variables in statistics. So we will create a control variable for, say, socioeconomic status, or SES. And then we'll measure all of our participants and our non-participants on their SES level. And then that becomes the control variable. Because if we can then control for SES, we can take it out of the equation and then truly isolate the real relationship between participation in this program and whatever our dependent variable is. One of the most common types of quasi-experimental designs that we use in program evaluation are longitudinal time series analysis. We will collect data on all these different relevant variables on both our participants and our non-participants over a period of time. That allows us to then track patterns in the data and how those variables change over the years. Very common quasi-experimental design is this longitudinal time series type of analysis. But the norm in program evaluation will be quasi-experimental designs because we rarely have the control we need for random assignment and to use a truly experimental type of design. Then, just like in social science research, in program evaluation, we need to decide where our data will come from. So which subjects are we going to collect data from? How are we going to identify what we call our sample? In an ideal world, we'd be able to collect data, we'd be able to collect information from our entire population, everyone who is affected or could be affected by this public program. Realistically, we don't have the time, we don't have the resources, nor do we have the cognitive abilities to be able to collect data from an entire population. So instead, we need to construct a sample, which is a subset of that population. So just like in social science research. Just like in social science research, here in program evaluation, we can decide whether we're going to use a probability type of sampling design or a non-probability sampling design. Probability sampling designs will use random sampling. So we will randomly select people from our population to serve in our sample. There are several different types of probability sampling designs that all use at least an element of random selection. Simple random sampling is the most purely random type of design that you can use to put together a sample. An example of simple random sampling for a program evaluation would be you get a list of your entire target population. And the target population is who you want to generalize to. So you have a list of everyone in your population. You assign a number to every single subject in your population. You then use either a random number generator table or a computer program that will generate random numbers, and you just randomly select numbers from that list until you get the size of the sample that you want. That tends to be very random in nature, and it tends to give us the most representative sample, a sample that very much represents the characteristics in our population. The problem, though, is we oftentimes don't have that list of subjects in our target population. A list of subjects in your target population, as you probably know from research methods, is referred to as a sampling frame. So you'll be selecting cases out of that sampling frame. We oftentimes lack a sampling frame in that we don't have a list of everyone in our population of interest. If we don't have a sampling frame, then the third approach up there is one we can use known as systematic sampling. In systematic sampling, we don't have a sampling frame, and so we have to construct our own. So an example of this could be, assume that there is a local public health clinic. And this local public health clinic provides services, medical services, to the surrounding community and members of that surrounding community on an anonymous basis. It's a walk-in anonymous basis. And what we want to do is we want to see how effective those services are that are being provided to that population. Obviously, we don't have a sampling frame because this is all being done with anonymity. So what you could literally do is the researcher could place themselves outside of this local public health clinic and then select maybe every 10th person who comes out to survey and collect data from. So you survey every 10th and 20th and 30th and 40th and 50th and so on person, and then that then becomes, those then become members of your sample. How many people you skip? You know, whether you're doing every 10th person or every 20th person or every 5th person, that's what's known as a skip interval. And in research, you know, it's represented by the lowercase k. So when you see k, that is a skip interval. And so your skip interval is every kth person, as you say, every 10th or 20th or 30th person that you select, that then is what you consider to be a skip interval. It's not purely random, because if your skip interval is 10 and you're selecting every 10th person, by definition, that means that person number 9 and person number 11 have a 0% chance of being selected. Pure random sampling says that every person in the population has an equal non-zero chance of being selected. That's what random selection is. Every person has an equal non-zero chance of being selected. Well, person number 9 and person number 11, they have an equal chance, but it's a chance of 0. And so therefore, it's not purely random. But that's an alternative if you don't have a sampling frame. Stratified random sampling is an approach you can use if you have a variable that is of such importance to you that you want to divide or stratify your sample according to that variable. So let's go back to our example of the inmate reading intervention program and its effect on recidivism rates. Maybe we know from previous research that the type of crime committed is something that's very important, especially if that crime included some relationship to drugs. So if there's a drug-related crime, those individuals who commit drug-related crimes have higher reoffending rates, recidivism rates, than people who commit other types of crime. So we might want to use a stratified random sampling approach where we will divide our sample up into those who have committed drug-related crimes and those that have committed non-drug-related crimes. And that would be a good use of this thing called stratified random sampling. You're just stratifying, splitting up your sample according to a certain type of variable or characteristic. And then multi-stage cluster sampling is a really good sampling approach to use if you are conducting evaluation of a program that you do not have a sampling frame at the unit of analysis you're interested in. So give an example. If you're looking at the impact of a program on households, you probably don't have a ready-made list of every single household in the state of California. And even if you could find that, it would be so huge and cumbersome, you wouldn't be able to deal with it. So you would use a multi-stage cluster sampling approach. So what you would do is you would start at the state level, and then you would go down to the county level, and you would collect a random sample of counties. From that random sample of maybe, say, 10 counties in California, you will then select a random sample of cities within those 10 counties. Then within those randomly selected cities, you will then select a random sample of neighborhoods. Then within that random sample of neighborhoods, you will select a random sample of streets. And then within that random sample of streets, you will then select a random sample of households. That's a multi-stage cluster sampling approach. You are doing multi-stage sampling, the state level, down to the county level, down to the city level, and so on and so on. Those different levels become your clusters. And so you've got an element of random selection at each one of those different clusters. Multi-stage cluster sampling is something that the Bureau of Labor Statistics uses and the Census Bureau uses very frequently. With the exception of the every 10-year enumeration of the population that's required in the Constitution, for the vast majority of other studies done by the Census Bureau, they will employ a multi-stage cluster sampling approach. But those are all probability samples that include some element of random selection. A non-probability type of sampling design does not have random selection. So it can be something like, an example is a convenience sample. So I want to know, I guess it's the bad example because there are only a few people in this class, but typically I have about 20 to 25 people in 500. So a convenience sample would be, I want to know what MPA students think about hybrid courses. And so since I teach an MPA course on Tuesday nights, those 25 people who are in front of me on Tuesday nights, I do a survey of those individuals because they are convenient to me. It's great that it's a low cost and easy way to do it, but the problem is obviously those 25 folks may not be representative of the larger population of MPA students throughout the entire MPA program. Another example of a non-probability design that is frequently used is what's called a snowballing technique. So say, for instance, we want to look at the impact and the effectiveness of a program that's targeted toward persons who are homeless. Well, the problem is that we don't have a sampling frame. We don't have addresses or contact information for those people in the homeless population. So instead, we will ask one person who is homeless, and then we'll have that person refer us to someone else who is homeless, who will refer us to someone else who is homeless, and so on and so on. It's a referral way of putting together a sample. You can see why it's called snowballing, because the more referrals you get, the bigger and the bigger your sample then becomes. Again, there's no right or wrong answer in terms of which type of sampling design to use in program evaluation. It all depends upon the situation in which you find yourself. How much control you have over your population. Do you have a sampling frame? All these things will come into play in terms of determining what is the most appropriate sampling design to use. Once you have your sample constructed, then just like in classic social science research methods, you'll then collect the data. One of the most prominent ways in which we collect data today in program evaluation is through survey research. So we will construct surveys, we'll administer those surveys, and then collect the data in those survey responses. There are some MPA programs that will have standalone classes on survey construction. That's how important surveys have become in public program evaluation. But when you take your 696 course, you'll spend at least one full week talking about surveys, constructing surveys, talking about how to write unbiased questions, talking about how to write response categories that attach to those unbiased questions. You'll talk about question sequencing, strategies such as bearing sensitive questions later in the survey. If you ask the sensitive question as a first or second question, you're going to turn people off. They're not going to fill out the survey. However, if you ask those sensitive questions down in questions 17 or 18, they've already answered 16 or 17 questions. They've already are invested in that survey. They're probably going to go ahead and answer those more sensitive questions. You'll talk about question length. You'll talk about how long the survey should be, presentation of the survey, and email distributions versus in person. You'll talk about all that when you get to 696. But once you then collect your surveys, you analyze the data that you've gotten, and this is where the dreaded statistics come into play. This is why we require everyone, before they get a permit to register for 696, that everyone has either completed 517, the Analytical Skills Development course, or demonstrate that you have completed an undergraduate statistics course, because we want you to have that statistics training before you go into 696 and start talking about program evaluation. The type of statistical analysis you use will again depend upon the purpose of your evaluation. Most of our evaluations tend to be program impact evaluations, and program impact evaluations are by definition causal research. So we'll use statistics that are in line with our purpose of causal research, of seeing how does participation in this program, how does that then cause a change in our dependent variable. We'll then take our data, we'll take our data analysis, and we'll arrive at our conclusions. Now, you would normally think that once you go through this program evaluation process, if you find that the program is not effective, and the program is not achieving its goals, it's not providing the consequences and benefits to our participants, to our beneficiaries, you would think that would then be a death knell for that program. That program would then go out of existence. The fact of the matter is, usually programs do not go out of existence because of poor program evaluation results. There are political reasons why programs will continue even if they are not highly effective. But hopefully, through this program evaluation process, we'll have a feedback loop where we can feed our information back into the program design so that we can redesign the program to hopefully make it more effective. We can have a feedback loop where we can feed back this information into the implementation process so that we can make the implementation process more effective and more efficient as well. The biggest problem with program evaluation is a lack of resources. Elected officials, budget makers don't like to put a lot of resources into program evaluation because there's very little political bang for the buck, if you will. There's very little political benefit that they get from program evaluations. Program evaluations may turn up some negative information that this program is not being properly implemented or this program is poorly designed. That's information that a lot of elected officials don't want to deal with. And so, unfortunately, in the public sector, program evaluation tends to be resource starved. But if we really do want our programs to be effective, we need to engage in this type of program evaluation. And again, the purpose of program evaluation is the same as policy analysis. We are trying to make our policies and programs as effective as they possibly can be. So I think it's important at this point, now we've gone through policy analysis and talked about the steps in policy analysis, and we've talked about the steps that we go through in program evaluation. We know the primary purpose of both endeavors is to see whether or not these policies and programs are truly effective. I think at this point, it's incumbent upon us to really delve into this issue of effectiveness and to really come up with a definition of what we mean by effectiveness. Effectiveness in the public sector is a term that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people and a lot of different agencies. Fortunately for us, the literature recommends to us 4 different models for measuring and defining effectiveness. And those 4 different models are the goal attainment approach, the systems resource approach, the participant satisfaction approach, and the internal process approach. So 4 different models of how we can define and then measure effectiveness in the public sector. The goal approach or the goal attainment approach is the one that we are most familiar with. This is one, if you say, how do you know if a program is effective? Well, is it achieving its goals? What are its stated goals? And then how well is the program or policy achieving those goals? That's a goal attainment approach. That's by far the most common way of measuring effectiveness in the public sector. It is the simplest approach because it literally links up what we are doing with our goals. And if we're achieving our goals, then we decide we are being effective as an organization or effective as a policy or a program. The problem is that it is very simple, and it doesn't really consider a lot of the complications that can go on in implementing policies and implementing programs. It's very much concerned with the output side. It's very much concerned with the goals, but it doesn't really look at all the things that can complicate the achievement of those goals. It doesn't really take into account impacts of a crisis. And so something like a COVID-19 pandemic doesn't really take that into account. We'll just say, well, the program didn't achieve its goals. Well, maybe one of the reasons why it didn't is because you had a worldwide, almost unprecedented pandemic that interfered with the achievement of the goals. It doesn't really consider different types of organizations and hierarchies in different organizations, conflict between goals, multiplicity of goals. So it is a very, very simple approach, but it is still the approach that most organizations will use when they're evaluating policies and evaluating programs. The second model of effectiveness is what's known as the systems resource model, which is very similar. If you remember our discussion of the development of organization theory, it's very similar to that school of thought we talked about, which was systems theory. Systems resource theory looks at how the organization interacts with its environment and the ability of the organization to pull in new resources and new energies from the environment. So effectiveness is measured by the organization's ability to exploit resources from the environment. So organization is implementing a program. It has a certain finite amount of appropriations that it is allowed to spend in implementing that program. If the organization is able to bring new resources and new revenue in from the environment to provide more resources for implementing the program, that can be considered as an indicator of effectiveness. There are a lot of resources you can bring in from your outside environment. You can bring in money. You can bring in grants. You can bring in highly specialized or professional employees into your organization. You can bring in political support from elected officials and constituents. Those are all resources you can bring into the organization, and your ability to bring in those resources from your environment is considered an indicator of effectiveness. So this takes usually a longitudinal type of approach, where you look at the resources that the organization has in the beginning, and then you look at how those resources have increased over time. If you've increased those resources over time, you are effective from a systems resource type of perspective. So it's how well can you exploit your environment in order to bring in new resources into your organization. That is oftentimes a measure of effectiveness as well. A third model of effectiveness is the participant satisfaction model. Here we're looking at our ability through the implementation of our policies and our programs to satisfy our core constituencies, to satisfy our beneficiaries outside the organization, those people who are participating in our programs, to satisfy elected officials, those who are funding our programs with appropriations, our ability to satisfy employees within our organization in kind of a human relations type of approach. So in the participant satisfaction model of effectiveness, we are trying to satisfy both external as well as internal constituencies. We see cities do this all the time with their citizen satisfaction surveys. And I don't know if you've received any of these surveys from the city in which you live, but they're a very common approach where you'll ask citizens, how satisfied are you with all these different services? The quality of the services you're receiving as a citizen, as well as the quantity of those services that you are receiving. That's a participant satisfaction approach to effectiveness. If we are satisfying our core constituencies and our core stakeholders, then that is an indicator of effectiveness. So our effectiveness is predicated upon satisfying those core stakeholders and core constituencies. Then the fourth model is known as the internal process model. The internal process model defines effectiveness as indicators of internal health and efficiency within your public organization. So organizations are considered to be effective if they have a strong culture, a strong organization culture, a strong positive work climate. If there's kind of an esprit de corps, this feeling of a team spirit among everyone within the organization. If our employees feel loyal to the organization, if we have strong orientations toward teamwork among our employees, if we have high levels of confidence and trust and communication between workers and management, if our decision-making process is located close to information sources, regardless of where these sources are on the organization chart. In other words, we are allowing those who are doing the tasks on a daily basis, who are the experts in how these tasks need to be done, are we allowing those individuals to autonomously make decisions, rather than making decisions for them at the top level of the organization and just transmitting those decisions down the organization chart. Sharing of relevant facts and feelings, both horizontal and vertical. So again, a very open communication system, vertically as well as horizontally in the organization. Rewards to managers for performance, growth, and development of subordinates to create an effective working group. Again, the public sector, we are somewhat limited in our ability to reward managers and employees with extrinsic rewards. A lot of the rewards we have to give to our employees and our managers are much more intrinsic in nature. They're not going to be promotions, not going to be money, not going to be bonus pay, but rather it's going to be recognition for a job well done. Interaction between the organization and its parts, with conflicts that occur over projects resolved in the interests of the organization. So when there are conflicts in the organization, do those conflicts get resolved in a way that benefits the organization? Essentially, all these different indicators in the internal process model basically all add up to this term we know as organizational health. Organizational health are those organizations that have all these different indicators: a strong culture, strong positive work climate, team spirit, supportive communication. That's what makes a healthy organization. And so the internal process model would say you are effective when you have a healthy organization. So what? So we've got these four different models: the goal attainment model, the systems resource model, the participant satisfaction model, and the internal process model. So what? The big so what is they all suggest for us different ways for us to measure effectiveness. At the end of the day, in the public sector, regardless of what policy or what program we are implementing or evaluating, our ultimate goal is to try and be as effective as we possibly can be. We know that public administration is predicated on a wide range of values. The number one value we always start with is effectiveness. We say effectiveness, efficiency, social equity, political responsiveness, protection of individual rights, representative bureaucracy. We have a whole list of values that we really do value in the public sector. But at the top of that list always tends to be effectiveness. And the so what of this discussion is that there are many different ways of measuring effectiveness depending upon your organization and depending upon your orientation. Despite the four different models, the one that we typically tend to use is that goal attainment model. And that goal attainment model really does tend to carry the day, both in policy analysis as well as program evaluation. But policy analysis, program evaluation, the implementation and evaluation of policies, the implementation and evaluation of programs really does consume a lot of what we do on a daily basis in the public sector. But it's not everything that we do. And in addition to what we do with policies and with programs, we also then have to manage resources in order to carry out those policies and those programs. If you don't have the human resources in your organization, you don't have adequate staffing in your organization, clearly you will never be able to have effectiveness with your public policies or your public programs. If you don't have the money, you don't have the appropriation and the resources in your organization, you are clearly never going to be able to achieve effectiveness in either policies or in the programs that you are implementing. So the way in which you kind of look at in this class is that policy analysis, program evaluation are two of the major core functions of public administrators that go hand in hand with other functions such as managing human resources and managing fiscal resources. Managing human resources is where we are going next in this class. And we'll take a break tonight. When we come back from our break, we'll start to introduce the management of human resources as another important function for public administrators. We'll finish up the management of human resources in our last class session next week, and then also talk about the management of fiscal resources, again, as core functions of public administration. So it's about 10 after 5, so let's go ahead. Let's take about a let's take about a 15-minute break. Come on back at, we'll say come back at 5:25, and when you come back at 5:25, we'll start to kind of foreshadow the management of human resources and talk about the evolution of public employment in the United States. Again, it's kind of a stepping stone to get us to our next function, which is the management of human resources. So take a break, come back at 5:25, and we'll get into that topic. Okay, well, we are back from break. So in the second half of class tonight, what I'd like to do is, again, start talking about management of human resources. And as we know, probably 85 to 90% of most public budgets are consumed by human resources. They're consumed by salaries, they're consumed by benefits. And so clearly managing human resources is an extremely important function for any public administrator in any public organization. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of the functions of human resource management, which I think we'll probably save for next week, let's just kind of foreshadow the topic by talking more generally about public personnel management in this country and the types of people who are public administrators and how we have hired and decided who to hire, who not to hire into the federal bureaucracy. So we've had three distinct eras of public employment in this country: the era of gentlemen, the era of spoils, and the era of merit. So at the founding of the country in the late 1700s, up until about 1828, our approach was what's known as the era of gentlemen. We selected people to work in government based upon oftentimes their social standing in society. So these were folks who came from the quote unquote best family backgrounds, who came from the best educational institutions, who had the degrees. We were really selecting people who we felt were kind of from that upper crust of society. And the reason for that is to try and make this new fledgling national government look more legitimate in the eyes of the people. You know, you talked to me on the midterm assessment about the differences between the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. And one of the major differences as we replaced the Articles with the Constitution was this movement toward national as opposed to a state type of focus. So there's a lot of distrust. You know, again, you had to have 10 amendments to the Constitution. You had to have Hamilton and Jay and Madison write these 85 Federalist Papers in order to convince people to support this new national government. So the new national government was really struggling for legitimacy in the late 1700s and the early 1800s. And so that's who we picked to work in government in this era of gentlemen. Then, like we oftentimes have happen in big policy changes, we had a triggering event. And when we talked about policy about John Kingdon and the triggering events and how these triggering events or these choice opportunities can lead to major changes in our policy orientations. We had a major triggering event in 1824. And in 1824, the presidential election of 1824, you had three primary candidates. You had a lot of candidates, but you had three primary candidates. One primary candidate was John Quincy Adams. Another primary candidate was Andrew Jackson. And the third primary candidate was Henry Clay. Because you had these three primary candidates, you had a situation where none of the candidates won a majority of the votes in the Electoral College. Now, from our reading of the Constitution, we are familiar with what happens if no one wins a majority in the Electoral College. If no one's able to secure a majority of the votes in the Electoral College, the election then goes to the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives, with each congressional delegation getting one vote, then decides who will be president, and then the Senate decides who will be vice president. So in 1824, the election was thrown into the House of Representatives. But what ended up happening is Andrew Jackson had more popular votes than either John Quincy Adams or Henry Clay. Andrew Jackson also had more electoral votes than either John Quincy Adams or Henry Clay. So you would think that when the election goes to the House of Representatives, Andrew Jackson would be selected as president. Well, what happened is that you had this bargain that was worked out between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. Henry Clay was in third. And so John Quincy Adams went to Henry Clay and said, if you will throw your supporters behind me and have your congressional delegations vote for me, then I will give you a cabinet position. Lo and behold, then these congressional delegations that have been loyal to Henry Clay then turned and supported John Quincy Adams. It gave John Quincy Adams the majority he needed in the House of Representatives to then be declared president. He became president, and then lo and behold, not long after that, Henry Clay then got appointed to a cabinet position. It's what came to be known as the corrupt bargain. This corrupt bargain, which deprived Andrew Jackson of the White House in 1824, really served as a triggering event to shift us from the era of gentlemen to an era we know as the era of spoils, or sometimes referred to as the era of patronage. In 1828, when Jackson ran against John Quincy Adams again, Andrew Jackson trounced John Quincy Adams. Got big majorities in the popular vote, got big majorities in the Electoral College, and Andrew Jackson became president. When Jackson comes into the White House, he brings with him a different approach to government employment. He felt that average ordinary citizens could do the work of government. You didn't have to be a gentleman. You didn't have to be from the upper echelon of society, but average ordinary citizens could do the work of government. And so once Jackson becomes president, we move into what's called the era of spoils or patronage. Era of gentlemen, you got your position in government based upon who you were. In the era of spoils, you got your position based upon who you knew. Who did you support? Did you support the winning candidate? Did you support the winning political party? The phrase that is most aptly applied to the era of spoils is, to the victor go the spoils. So if the winning political party, once they go into office, they can then give jobs out to their political supporters. So you got your job based upon your party affiliation and whether or not you supported the winning candidate. So we had this at the federal level. We then had the rise of all of these machines, these political machines in our major cities, like the discussion we had in a previous class about George Washington Plunkett and the Tammany Hall political machine in New York City. That was illustrative of this whole era of spoils. And in fact, in Plunkett of Tammany Hall, George Washington Plunkett gives advice to, at that time he said, to young men about how to get into government and how to move up in government and have a career in government. And his advice to young men was that you don't fill your head with college rot. Now those are his words, not mine. Don't bother filling your heads with college rot. Instead of going to college, you should start working on a campaign. Work on a campaign, become a precinct chairperson, round up votes for people who are running for office so that when they win, that's how you then get rewarded with a job in government. So to the victor go the spoils. So we had this era of patronage, this era of spoils going on not only at the federal level, but also prominently at the state and local levels of government as well. And Tammany Hall was just one of those political machines. We had political machines in Boston and Chicago and all across the country. The problem with the era of spoils, obviously, is you are not hiring people based upon their qualifications. You're hiring people based upon how well they can help you win an election. And we know that the skills it takes to win an election are not the same skills it takes to govern effectively. And we saw that painfully throughout this era of spoils. We had a lot of corruption, we had a lot of incompetence, a lot of inefficiency, a lot of problems during this era of spoils. But just like the era of gentlemen led to the era of spoils because of a triggering event, the corrupt bargain of 1824, we then had a triggering event in the early 1880s that then led us to move from the era of spoils to the era of merit. And that triggering event was the assassination of President Garfield. So President Garfield wins the election in 1880, becomes president. In 1881, he is assassinated. And Garfield was assassinated by a gentleman by the name of Charles J. Guiteau. And Charles J. Guiteau was an interesting fellow. He was an author. He was a philosopher. He thought that he would be a great ambassador to France. And Guiteau had written some campaign speeches for Garfield when he was a candidate. There's no evidence whatsoever that Garfield used any of these speeches, even knew the speeches existed, or even knew that Charles J. Guiteau existed as a human being. But Guiteau thought that since he had written these speeches and it helped Garfield get elected to the White House, it's the era of spoils after all, so therefore he should get a position, and the position he wanted was ambassador to France. So Guiteau, being the less than rational person he was, thought that if he assassinated President Garfield, Garfield's vice president was Chester Arthur. Chester Arthur was a big believer in the era of spoils. So obviously, if Guiteau assassinates Garfield, then Chester Arthur then ascends to the presidency, and Chester Arthur would then reward Guiteau with his position as ambassador to France. Clearly, that didn't happen. Guiteau did not get his ambassadorship. Guiteau instead got executed for his assassination of Garfield. But it was a shocking enough event that it really galvanized public opinion around the idea that we need to make a change to the way in which we hire people to work in government. And there is a gentleman in Congress by the name of Pendleton. And for many years, Pendleton had carried around a draft piece of legislation that would change the era of spoils and make it into an era of merit, where we would start hiring people based upon their qualifications, kind of modeled on the British civil service system. When Garfield was assassinated, that was the triggering event that allowed Pendleton to then introduce his legislation into Congress, and eventually that legislation became what's known as the Pendleton Act. You see a picture of Charles Pendleton on the screen. The Pendleton Act, again, brought the British civil service system to America. And it said, now we're going to hire people based upon their qualifications. How do we know that they have the qualifications, that they have the merit necessary to do the job well? We'll have a system of examinations, and those will be open examinations. Woodrow Wilson talked about this in his article, that we can borrow the British civil service system, but we need to take their closed examinations and make them open. So we had a system of open examinations where anyone could sit for this examination, and if they scored well enough, that would then qualify them to be hired into the federal bureaucracy. So it's a complete reorientation of the way in which we hire people. It created this thing known as our civil service system. And we'll talk about the civil service system more on the next slide, but it creates a civil service system where you are hired based upon your merit. You are then keep your job based upon your merit, And if you are dismissed from your position, you're not dismissed because of politics, but if you're dismissed, it's because of the quality of your work. So the goal of the Pendleton Act was to try and insulate these bureaucrats, these public administrators, from the influence of politics. So in 1883, we get the Pendleton Act and we usher in this new era of merit. We usher in the era of merit at the national level, which obviously trickles down into a lot of state and local governments. Actually, years before the Pendleton Act, in the 1870s, we had municipal leagues who were advocating for this era of merit. So once we get the Pendleton Act at the federal level, there was a great rush toward merit-based hiring at state and local levels as well. So in 1883, we get this era of merit thanks to the Pendleton Act. Then for many years, the Pendleton Act and civil service governs the employment of people in the federal bureaucracy. But over the years, we realized that we were insulating people from politics, but we weren't really demanding anything back from them. We're saying that you can't be fired for political reasons. We're going to protect you from those political firings. We realized that we needed to ask them to step up, and if we're going to protect them from political firings, we need to expect that they will not engage in political activities while in office or engage in political activities using their public resources. And so to truly have this break between administration and politics, 1939, 1940, we end up getting the Hatch Act. We get a Hatch Act at the federal level, and then we get mini Hatch Acts in all the states. The Hatch Act then required that public officials were not allowed to use their public time or their public resources or their public office for political endeavors. That you could not campaign for a candidate or a political party during your time on the job. You could not use resources from your public office like letterhead and things such as that to campaign. You can't make phone calls to do political types of activities. You are not allowed to engage in any of those political activities while on the job using your public resources. And so now we have little Hatch Acts in all states across the country, again, demanding something out of these public administrators. We will protect you from political reprisal, but you must not engage in political activities on your own. So you can fast forward then to the Carter administration in the late 1970s. In 1978, we had now had this Pendleton Act for almost 100 years, so about 95 years by then. Subsequent to the passage of the Pendleton Act, we had modifications and changes along the way, so that by the time we get to 1978, in the Carter administration, we had a patchwork of laws affecting public personnel management, especially at the federal level. So what Carter wanted to do is he wanted to kind of sort out all this patchwork of all these different laws and pieces of legislation. So in 1978, we get this piece of legislation through Congress and signed by the president known as the Civil Service Reform Act. The Civil Service Reform Act was designed to modify the Pendleton Act to make it easier to understand and to clarify this relationship between employees and politics. And so there are a whole lot of different reasons why we had the Civil Service Reform Act. But the Civil Service Reform Act essentially transformed the federal bureaucracy and transformed the way in which we hire people to work in the federal government. So in the Civil Service Reform Act, we established several new agencies. One agency under the Civil Service Reform Act was this agency known as OPM, the Office of Personnel Management. And all these agencies we're talking about that were created in 1978, they're still with us and still active today. So the Office of Personnel Management. The goal of creating this Office of Personnel Management is that OPM would basically be the central clearinghouse for government hiring. So whenever agencies wanted to hire people into their agency, they would create a job description, a position announcement that would have to be approved by OPM. OPM would advertise that. If there were examinations that were required, OPM would administer those examinations, would score those examinations, would then provide a list of usually the top 3 or the top 5 scorers to the agency. The agency could then interview those top 3 or those top 5 scorers. But the hiring process really was then centralized through the Office of Personnel Management. So the Office of Personnel Management did for Personnel and Human Resources what the Office of Management and Budget does for the budget and financial side of the federal government. Then secondly, we set up this thing called the Merit Systems Protection Board, otherwise known as the MSPB, the Merit Systems Protection Board. And the Merit Systems Protection Board was established to protect people's merit principles. So if you felt that you were being dismissed or you were having reprisals against you because of political motivations, you could take your case to the Merit Systems Protection Board. The Merit Systems Protection Board then, in a very quasi-judicial type of hearing, would then investigate your claims, would hold a hearing on your claims, and determine whether or not your merit principles had been violated by your agency. If they found that your merit principles had been violated by your agency, you would be reinstalled into your position, you would get back pay, and there would be disciplinary action against your agency. So the Merit System Protection Board was there to try and protect people from political reprisals. Again, to try and make sure that they're being treated based upon how they're doing the job and how well they're doing the job on their merit, as opposed to their political party preference. Then you had a third organization created called the Office of Special Counsel. And the Office of Special Counsel did a similar type of function to the Merit Systems Protection Board, but the difference is that if you saw someone's merit principles being violated, and you saw someone being subject to political reprisals, you could then report that case to the Office of Special Counsel. So the Office of Special Counsel is where you would go if you saw something going on that did not directly affect you as an individual. So this is a place that whistleblowers would go to. We talked a lot about whistleblowers when we talked about accountability and ethics. So if someone's blowing the whistle, they blow the whistle to the Office of Special Counsel. Office of Special Counsel, then kind of like the MSPB, is a quasi-judicial type of investigation and hearing to determine if there's any credibility to the claims of political reprisal. So if you're a whistleblower, you would go to the Office of Special Counsel. The problem was that under the original Civil Service Reform Act, the Office of Special Counsel was created as an entity within the Merit Systems Protection Board. So it didn't have its own independent staff. It was part of the MSPB. The problem with that is because it didn't have its own independent staff, it didn't have its own independent budget, it was overwhelmed with cases. And so there was a massive backlog of cases in the Office of Special Counsel. In 1990, we got this thing called the Whistleblowers Protection Act, and the Whistleblowers Protection Act then pulled the Office of Special Counsel out of the Merit Systems Protection Board, made it its own independent agency with its own independent staff and its own independent budget and appropriations. Then the fourth organization created is the FLRA, which is the Federal Labor Relations Authority. Again, I'm talking and typing, so if I have some typos in text chat, I apologize, but the Federal Labor Relations Authority, or the FLRA. The Federal Labor Relations Authority was placed in charge of the collective bargaining process in the federal government. So a lot of our federal agencies have a collective bargaining process where employees are unionized, and the bargaining units for these unions will then engage in negotiations with the agency over contracts. The FLRA is in charge of overseeing that collective bargaining process. The FLRA is in charge of collective bargaining for pretty much all the agencies in the federal government, with the exception of the U.S. Postal Service. The U.S. Postal Service, this oversight comes from the National Labor Relations Board, or the NLRB. And the NLRB does a similar type of thing as the FLRA, but does it for the private sector. So other than the U.S. Postal Service, everyone else, for the most part, on the federal level, they're under the auspices of the FLRA for the collective bargaining process. So what does the FLRA do? Throughout collective bargaining, if one party, whether it be the union or whether it be management, the agency, if one party feels the other party is engaging in unfair labor practices, otherwise known as ULPs, unfair labor practices, they can take that claim of an unfair labor practice to the FLRA. Prominent example of the FLRA not long after it was created was in the early part of the Reagan administration. Early part of the Reagan administration, air traffic controllers were unionized and their contract had come to an end. And so they were going through the collective bargaining process. They were at an impasse with the FAA. So what ended up happening is that air traffic controllers then threatened to go on strike. President Reagan said, this is a public safety position. We can't have air traffic controllers going on strike. It'll shut down our airline service across the country. So he told Airline Traffic Controllers Union that if your members go out on strike, I will fire them. So air traffic controllers went on strike, and Reagan did a mass firing of air traffic controllers. The Air Traffic Controllers Union then took the case to the Federal Labor Relations Authority and said this is a violation of fair labor practices. The Federal Labor Relations Authority sided with the Reagan administration and said it's not unfair because it's a public safety position. And as a public safety position, we can't have air traffic controllers going on strike and shutting down the skies. And so because of that decision the FLRA made in the Reagan administration, for years after that, public employee unions at the federal level didn't really trust the Federal Labor Relations Authority. And it took a long time for the FLRA to kind of build back their trust with those public employee unions. But they oversee the collective bargaining process. They make sure there are no unfair labor practices going on. They also make sure that both sides are engaging in what's called good faith bargaining. Good faith bargaining means that you are coming to the bargaining table ready to come to an agreement. That you're not doing what's called regressive bargaining, that when you put a proposal out there, all of your future proposals will be better than the first proposal you put out. If you put out a proposal and the union doesn't accept it and they say, well, we're going to take that back and we're going to give you a worse proposal next time, that's called regressive bargaining, and that would not be an example of bargaining in good faith. So we get this FLRA to try and control and oversee the bargaining process, collective bargaining process at the federal level. And then the fifth thing we created is this thing called the Senior Executive Service. The Senior Executive Service was created to kind of try and bridge the gap between political appointees up here and the majority of civil service employees throughout our organizations. So what happens is we have these federal agencies and departments that are staffed primarily by career civil servants, people who get their positions based upon their qualifications. They took an exam or they had the knowledge, skills, and abilities to get the position. But at the upper leadership and management positions in these agencies, we have political appointees, people who are appointed by the president, and for some of those positions need to be confirmed by the Senate. Some do, some don't, but they're political appointees. The problem we had is we had a gap then between these political appointees and career civil servants. Political appointees, because they're appointed by the president, typically are there to try and further the policy positions of the president. Career civil servants are there for a career. So a lot of career civil servants, if they didn't like the direction that these political appointees were taking the agency in, they would just say, I'm going to wait them out. This political appointee is going to be here for maybe 18, 24 months, and then they're going to be gone. I'm going to be here for 30 to 40 years. So you had a lot of trouble with these political appointees leading their agencies. So the purpose of the Senior Executive Service was to take the very top level of career civil servants and put them into the Senior Executive Service to bridge this gap between political appointees and all these career civil servants. The Senior Executive Service was created in order to bridge this gap, and people were induced to join the Senior Executive Service because they were promised bonus pay. Congress said if you join the senior executive service, you give up some of your career civil service protections. But if your organization performs well, if your organization is making substantial progress toward achieving its goals, you're going to get bonus pay for the performance of your organization. Also, another inducement to join the senior executive service, other than bonus pay, was that you could have lateral movement between agencies. And so if you were working for one agency and you wanted to move into an equivalent position in another agency, you could do that relatively easily if you were a member of the senior executive service. The problem, obviously, is that Congress promised bonus pay if you join the senior executive service. Congress then failed to make good on that bonus pay. They failed to make good on it because when you look at the late 1970s and the early 1980s, we were running federal budget deficits each and every year. And every year, those federal budget deficits were getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So there just wasn't any money to go into bonus pay. And so Congress violated the promise that they had made to these members of the senior executive service. It left a lot of members of the senior executive service very disaffected, and survey after survey shows that if they had it to do over again, they would not have joined the senior executive service. But despite that, the senior executive service is still alive and well today. But this Civil Service Reform Act, through the creation of Merit Systems Protection Board and the Office of Special Counsel and the Federal Labor Relations Authority and the Senior Executive Service, fundamentally transforms the way in which we hire and manage employees at the federal level. I can't really emphasize enough how big of a change it was to how we manage people in the federal bureaucracy. And all these agencies and these approaches are certainly still with us today. So as a result of the Pendleton Act, as a result of the Civil Service Reform Act, we have this system known as civil service. And if you work in a government agency, you are probably part of a civil service system. Even if you work at the local level, you're probably part of a civil service system. The idea behind civil service is that, again, we're hiring people based upon their qualifications, based upon their expertise and their merit, and then we are rewarding them based upon their merit as well. They keep their jobs based upon their merit. At the federal level, the civil service system is known as the General Schedule. The General Schedule is a position classification system across the entire federal government. The General Schedule is broken up into different grade levels and different steps within those grades. It's what's known as a step and column system. And most local governments have a step and column system. Education agencies are very well known for teachers for having step and column systems. So this step and column system at the federal level known as the General Schedule. At the bottom of the General Schedule, basically the General Schedule technically runs from a General Schedule 1 grade up to a General Schedule 15 grade. So today that's how it works. Before the Civil Service Reform Act, it ran from a General Schedule 1 up to a General Schedule 18. But what we did in the Civil Service Reform Act is we took those GS 16, 17, and 18 positions, those top 3 places on the General Schedule, and we moved those folks into the Senior Executive Service. So now we have GS 1 through GS 15 in your Career Civil Service General Schedule. And then we have ES1, ES2, ES3, ES4, and ES5. ES stands for the Senior Executive Service. Practically, there really aren't GS1 and GS2 positions. Where the General Schedule really starts is kind of at the GS3 or GS4 position. GS3 or GS4 positions are typically internships. They're typically student positions at the very bottom of this General Schedule. Most full-time entry-level positions tend to be in the range of GS5 to GS7. Mid-level positions, once you start getting into supervisory types of positions, those are GS8 through GS12. And then your top-level supervisory positions are GS13 to GS15. Everything above GS15, what used to be 16, 17, and 18, are now part of that Senior Executive Service, ES1 through ES5. The purpose of having a general schedule like this and a position classification like this is that you can reward people and compensate people based upon the nature of the work that they are doing. And within each one of these grades, you're then going to have steps that will reward people for longevity in that position. So you could be a GS 12 step 8, and that'll put you to the right of the schedule. As you move up grade levels and as you move across to the right in steps, you make more and more money. So the compensation levels go up and up as you move up grade levels and as you move over in terms of additional service and additional step levels. So it's a way in which we can compensate people equitably for the work that they are doing. So everyone's going to have a position that has a position classification grade and step to it. And that will then determine your compensation. So the advantage is obviously we can treat people equitably based upon their position as opposed to treating people differently based upon them being individuals. The disadvantage obviously is that it's a very strict system of compensation. So it makes it difficult if we want to reward someone and we want to say, well, this person's doing a great job, so we want to give them some bonus pay. We want to give them some merit pay. It's really difficult for us to do that without reclassifying their position. So the only way they're going to get additional compensation other than the normal adjustment of the COLA, and every year pay tends to increase by 2 or 3% to keep up with the cost of inflation. But beyond COLA increases, the only way to pay them more is to reclassify their position. There's a way to do that. They're called reclassification studies, and employees can apply for a reclassification study, and then the agency will come and shadow that employee and see what they do on a daily basis to see if the nature of their work has substantially changed enough to warrant a higher grade level. But if the nature of the work has not changed, they're not doing additional functions or doing them differently, then that position is not going to be eligible for reclassification, and the compensation level is going to stay pretty much the same. So it makes it really difficult for us to do things like pay for performance in the public sector when we have these position classification systems like the general schedule at the federal level. But the nice thing again about civil service is it affords you protection, and that you cannot be fired for political reasons. You cannot be subject to arbitrary and capricious firings. In the private sector, most employees are at will, which means they can be fired for a variety of reasons other than discrimination. Obviously, discrimination is discrimination, but they can be fired on a whim as long as it's not a discriminatory firing. In the public sector, you can't fire someone on a whim. They have civil service protections. The only way you can terminate someone is for deficient performance. And the way in which you measure deficient performance is you have to have multiple documented performance evaluations. So you give this person a performance evaluation, you document their deficient performance, you then have to provide them training opportunities to remedy that deficiency, and then you have to evaluate them again. If their performance is still deficient, then you're going to have to give them more training opportunities and then evaluate them again. It will take multiple deficient performance evaluations and multiple opportunities for training before you can get to the point of actually terminating and getting rid of an employee. Very difficult to do it in the civil service. It is not impossible. And it's a misperception out there in the public that you cannot fire a government employee. That's not true. You can terminate a government employee, but you must have multiple instances of documented deficient performance in order to do so. And that's because of these civil service types of protections. So we have this civil service system, this position classification system. Overlaid on top of those civil service protections, public employees oftentimes also have collective bargaining types of protections as well. They have contractual protections. So if you are part of a unionized workforce, then you have a bargaining unit that will engage in collective bargaining on your behalf with your agency. In that collective bargaining process, the bargaining units, the agency will then negotiate to try and come up with a contract, and that contract will stipulate lots of different aspects of the work environment. It will stipulate, how the hiring process works. It'll stipulate, how the allocation of work works. It'll stipulate how people are evaluated, how frequently, and what the type of evaluation is. It will stipulate the sanctioning and discipline. Basically, all the major functions of the human resource process will be stipulated in most public sector contracts. So as a leader or manager in an agency, you have to be mindful of the civil service protections afforded to your employees, but you also have to be conversant in the contract as well, to know what the contract says so that you don't not only violate the civil service protections, but you also do not violate the protections afforded in this contract. So bargaining units in the agency will go through a collective bargaining process. Not all items are subject to collective bargaining. One prominent example from the federal level is, believe it or not, compensation. In collective bargaining at the federal level, bargaining units and agencies may not collectively bargain and negotiate over compensation of employees. The reason why compensation is not allowed to be bargained over at the federal level is because Congress establishes compensation. There is a compensation commission, and a colleague of mine from Brigham Young, who I used to work with in the past, was appointed by the Obama administration to serve on the compensation commission. And the compensation commission would meet, I think they met once a year or twice a year, and they would review the general schedule. They would review inflation rates and all these different indicators of economic growth to determine whether or not to recommend to Congress increasing the pay of federal employees. So since Congress establishes the compensation of federal employees, you cannot collectively bargain over that. That's something that's established by Congress. Congress has control of it. So compensation is not something that's collectively bargained over at the federal level. However, it is something that's collectively bargained over at the state and local level in most states and localities. Other things that can be collectively bargained over, in addition to compensation at the state and local level, work conditions. And so the conditions in which you're carrying out your work, that can be bargained over. Things such as disciplinary actions, evaluation processes, all those things can be part of collective bargaining. All the issues that are permitted to be discussed in collective bargaining are said to be within what we call the scope of bargaining, within the permissive scope of bargaining. So if it's something you can negotiate over and collectively bargain over, it is within your scope of bargaining. Everything you're not allowed to discuss is beyond the scope of bargaining. Back when I was in graduate school, I worked on a project with a federal agency, and we were looking at the impact of different pieces of legislation on local school districts. And I found out through the course of the research that in the state of Ohio, teacher unions could not collectively bargain over privatization. The issue of privatization was not within the permissive scope of bargaining for any teacher unions within the state of Ohio. And every state will have its own permissive scope of bargaining. Bargaining happens through the collective bargaining process, but bargaining and negotiation can also happen through a process known as meet and confer. So say, for instance, and this happened a lot in the COVID-19 pandemic. So, say, for instance, a local school district must migrate its delivery of classes online. It has to go to remote instruction. By going to remote instruction, you are fundamentally changing the work conditions for those teachers. And when you fundamentally change the work conditions for those teacher unions can then require what's called a meet and confer process, where in a meet and confer, they get to sit down with management and they get to discuss these changes in their work conditions. So the meet and confer can happen at any time and usually deals with changes in work conditions. Collective bargaining usually happens in a period of time before the contract is about to expire. But sometimes through this negotiations process, the two sides cannot come to an agreement. When the two sides are unable to come to an agreement, you have what's called an impasse. There are different ways in which you can resolve impasses in collective bargaining. There are three basic ways to resolve an impasse. One way is through fact-finding, second way is through mediation, and a third way is through arbitration. In fact-finding, what you will do is you will bring in a third-party fact-finder. That person will come in, they will review what's happened in the collective bargaining process, and they'll write up a fact-finding report. The fact-finding report is usually not binding on either party. When that fact-finding report, that fact finder could say, well, this is what the union has said, and this is what the union's put together. This is what the agency has put together, and that'll be part of the fact-finding report. Sometimes the fact-finding report will look really good for the union, or maybe look really good for the agency, and can push one side toward trying to come to an agreement. So if you look really bad in the fact-finding report, there may be an incentive for you to come to an agreement more quickly than normal. Fact-finding reports are usually embargoed for a couple of weeks before they're released. The reason for that is that both sides get to see the fact-finding report in private and then hopefully come to a negotiated agreement in private before the entire public gets to see what the fact finder said. But these reports are non-binding. Second approach to resolving an impasse is mediation. Mediation would be you call in a mediator from the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. And there's a federal agency called the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. One of my political science professors undergrad was a federal mediator who contracted with this Mediation and Conciliation Service. So the good thing for us in the political science class is that we didn't have class very often because he was always jetting off to one state or another trying to resolve an impasse in the collective bargaining process. When these mediators come in, they literally sit down with both sides and try and work out an agreement. Typically, those agreements are not binding. So you just try and work out the agreement, but you're not bound on either side by the nature of this agreement that the mediator is able to come up with. The third approach is arbitration. In arbitration, if both sides agree to arbitration, or if state law requires arbitration, then you will have an arbiter come in, and the arbiter will review the proposals from both sides and will then make a decision. There are a few different ways you can do arbitration. One way is what's called final offer arbitration. Typically, final offer arbitration tends to be binding on both parties. So if you really need to come to an agreement, your contract's expired, you need to come up with a new contract, final offer arbitration will guarantee that you'll come up with a contract. So in final offer arbitration, it's just what it sounds like. The arbiter comes in, says, bargaining unit, labor, you show me your last offer. Management, you show me your last offer, and then I'm going to pick one of the two. The one that I pick is then binding on both parties, and that then becomes the substance of the contract. So final offer binding arbitration is a way that you can 100% resolve an impasse, but both sides are a little hesitant to agree to that because you never know which offer that arbiter is going to select. That arbiter selects an offer that's not yours, you're obviously not going to be very happy with that arbitration. But the important thing for us, and the big so what question for us, is as managers and as leaders, we have to be mindful of not only the civil service protections that employees have, but we also have to be mindful of the protections they're afforded within their contract that emerges from the collective bargaining process. That's a lot of moving parts to be concerned with as a leader or a manager. And so because of all these regulations and all the nuances of both civil service as well as contracts, what has happened is it's caused a lot of agencies to centralize their human resource management functions. And so now a lot of agencies have centralized human resource management within an Office of Human Resource Management. They're leaving those types of decisions to the professional human resource managers. And so they've taken a lot of the human resource functions out of the hands of day-to-day work of leaders and managers and have put them centralized within a human resource management office. The good news for someone who is going into the public sector is that if you're interested in human resource management, there are a lot of new positions that have been created in human resource management offices because of this centralization of the human resource management function. If you are interested in human resource management and you think that's something you'd like to do in the public sector, I would recommend to you, we have a certificate that you can get at the same time you're getting your MPA. It won't add on any additional classes. You can finish it in the same time frame as a normal MPA. That's the certificate in employee-employer relations. If you're really interested in that, that's a great certificate to do. And again, it's something you can do within the MPA program. You still only do 39 units, but when you graduate, you not only have the MPA, but you also have the certificate that could be very attractive for a human resource management office. So that kind of foreshadows for us this idea of human resource management, and kind of leads us then into the specific discrete functions that you engage in as you manage these human resources, which again, managing human resources is one of the primary jobs that you will do, or that agencies do, on a daily basis. But seeing that it's about 6:15, I don't want to go into these functions of human resource management because I know they're going to take us more than half an hour to talk about. So I would propose we stop here for the evening. Then when we come back next Tuesday for our last Zoom session, we will start with talking about the functions of human resource management. We'll talk about recruitment, we'll talk about allocation, and we'll talk about evaluation, talk about sanctioning and discipline. And then we'll transition in the second half of class next week into a discussion of how we manage fiscal resources. We'll talk about different types of budgets, different approaches to operating budgets, different approaches to capital budgets, and probably, I think, wrap up with that information. Because next week, once we get through management of fiscal resources, that will cover all the information that we need then to successfully do the final assessment. And I think probably at that point, that's probably all the information that we would need to cover then for the class. So are there any observations or any questions or anything on the material we've covered tonight, either on program evaluation, models of measuring effectiveness, or the federal bureaucracy and the 3 different eras in federal employment? Okay. All right, if not, I know there will be a couple of us here tonight, but for both Erin and Judy, thanks for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, now I'll get this recording up if you need to watch it again later on in the week, and then we'll get back together again one last time next Tuesday. All right? Thanks a lot.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Have a good night.
Have a good night. Enjoy your week.